The goblet gleamed under candlelight, ruby wine catching gold, and Elena Crowley smelled her mother's death rising from it. Her hands kept moving, clearing plates from the long table where the Vampire King's court feasted, but every breath confirmed what her instinct screamed. Bitter almond underneath floral notes, a metallic edge that didn't belong, and beneath it all that particular rotting sweet corruption she would recognize in her sleep, because it had taken her mother 3 agonizing months to die. The recipe cards were still in Elena's apron pocket, brittle with age, her mother's careful script naming every poison an apothecary's daughter needed to know. Hollow root extract, the card read, fatal to vampires in sufficient accumulation, undetectable by conventional means. The king lifted the goblet. Elena didn't think. She crossed the space between them in 3 quick steps, her voice barely a whisper but urgent enough to cut through the hall's din. "Don't drink it, my lord." His hand stopped midway to his lips. Then his other hand moved, fast as thought, and his fingers closed around her wrist with careful, inexorable strength. Not painful, but absolutely secure. The entire table went silent. 24 pairs of eyes turned toward the servant girl who had just touched the Vampire King uninvited. Mordecai Morven set the goblet down with his free hand, still holding her wrist, and looked at her with eyes the color of winter sky, pale and piercing in his white face. His hair fell like moonlight over his shoulders, and he was beautiful the way a sword was beautiful, all clean lines and barely restrained danger. But his voice when he spoke held only curiosity, warm and genuinely interested. "Why not?" "Hollow root," Elena said, keeping her voice low. "I can smell it. It killed my mother." Something shifted in his expression, a sharpness entering that casual interest. He released her wrist, picked up the goblet again, and this time brought it to his nose. He inhaled deeply, and she saw the moment frustration flickered across his face. "I smell wine," he said. "Good wine. Notes of cherry and oak." He paused, and there was something almost vulnerable in the admission that followed. "I smell nothing else." "But you do." It wasn't a question, but Elena nodded anyway. "My mother was an apothecary. She taught me before she died. Hollow root has a signature if you know it, underneath everything else." "Then we shall test your nose," Mordecai said, and without ceremony poured half the goblet's contents into an empty water glass. He beckoned to a guard. "Fetch a rat from the kitchens. A live one." The court watched in fascinated silence as a confused guard returned 5 minutes later with a fat kitchen rat in a wire cage. Mordecai poured a few drops of the wine onto a piece of bread and pushed it through the bars. The rat, unconcerned with courtly drama, ate enthusiastically. Then it began to shake. Within 2 minutes it was convulsing. Within 5 it lay still, white foam at its mouth. The silence that followed was profound. Mordecai stood, and when he moved it was with the fluid grace of a predator, no wasted motion, complete control. But there was nothing cold about him as he turned to Elena, only a brilliant, delighted interest that made her feel suddenly seen in a way she had never experienced. "You have just saved my life," he said, and his voice carried through the hall with absolute authority. "What is your name?" "Elena Crowley, my lord." "Elena Crowley," he repeated, as though tasting the syllables. "Where did you learn this gift?" "My mother kept recipe cards, antidotes, poisons, medicinal compounds. I grew up sorting them, memorizing them. She made me practice identifying things by scent alone." Elena's throat tightened. She was poisoned by a rival apothecary. Hollow root in her tea, a little each day. By the time we understood what was happening, the damage was too deep. His expression softened with something that looked remarkably like genuine sympathy. "How long ago?" 3 years. "And you kept her cards?" "They're all I have left of her." Mordecai nodded slowly, then turned to address the room. His voice shifted, taking on the resonance of absolute command. "Someone in this court just tried to murder me. The wine was poured from my personal cask, which means the poison was introduced before it reached my cup. I want the cellarer, the cupbearer, and everyone who had access to that cask brought before me within the hour. In the meantime, nothing gets consumed in this hall that hasn't been tested first." He paused, and his gaze returned to Elena with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "By my new taster." A ripple of shock moved through the assembled nobles. The vampire beside Mordecai, an ancient-looking creature with silver scars across his pale throat, leaned forward. "My lord, a human servant as your taster. Surely someone of higher station." "Someone of higher station just tried to poison me, Vasily," Mordecai interrupted, but there was no heat in it, only ironic amusement. "Right now I trust the girl with the dead mother's recipe cards more than I trust anyone at this table. Elena Crowley, will you accept the position?" It was insane. It was dangerous. It would make her a target for whoever had just tried to kill the king, but Elena looked at him, at the vampire who had listened to a servant's warning when he could have dismissed her, who had actually tested her claim instead of punishing her presumption, and found herself nodding. "Yes, my lord." "Excellent." Mordecai's expression brightened with that warm, delighted interest again. "Then let's find out who wants me dead." The next 3 hours were a lesson in how a vampire king conducted an investigation. Mordecai was nothing like Elena had expected. He didn't rage or threaten. Instead, he asked questions with genuine curiosity, listened to answers with complete attention, and managed to make even his most nervous suspects feel oddly at ease. The cellarer, a round human man with wine-stained fingers, nearly wept with relief when Mordecai casually mentioned that he'd been in service for 30 years and clearly knew his craft too well to make such a clumsy attempt. "Besides," Mordecai said cheerfully, "if you wanted to poison me, Wilhelm, you'd have used something that actually tasted good. That vintage was mediocre at best." Wilhelm had laughed despite his terror, and Elena began to understand that the Vampire King's greatest weapon wasn't his strength or his speed or his immortal authority. It was this disarming warmth that made people want to please him, want to be honest with him, want to live up to the faith he seemed to place in them so easily. But as the investigation continued and servants and nobles alike were questioned, Elena noticed something troubling. Mordecai would ask leading questions, would pause as though listening for hesitation, would tilt his head at certain answers. And increasingly, she saw frustration shadow his features when people responded. Finally, near midnight, when they were alone in his private study reviewing the list of suspects, he threw himself into a chair with uncharacteristic irritation. "I can't tell," he said, and there was real distress in his voice. "I should be able to tell when they're lying. It's instinct. It's in the heartbeat and the scent and the tiny catches in their breath. But it's all just noise now. Everyone sounds the same. Everyone smells the same." Elena set down the list she'd been reading. "How long has it been like this?" "Months." He ran a hand through his white hair, making it fall across his face in a way that was oddly boyish. "It started gradually. I thought I was just distracted, preoccupied with the treaty negotiations with the Eastern courts. But it's gotten worse. 3 months ago, I could still catch the obvious lies. Now I catch nothing." He looked at her with those pale, piercing eyes. "Do you understand what that means for a king? I can't tell who's loyal. I can't tell who's plotting. I can't tell if my advisors are giving me truth or convenient fiction. I've been ruling blind." Understanding clicked into place. "You think you've been poisoned for months, not to kill you but to cripple you." "Hollow root in small doses," Mordecai said. "That's what your mother's cards say, isn't it? It builds up slowly, affecting the senses. Tonight was meant to be the final dose, enough to finish what months of preparation had begun." Elena pulled the relevant card from her pocket, hands shaking slightly as she read her mother's careful notes. "Hollow root affects the blood first, then the senses. In vampires specifically, it disrupts the ability to detect deception because it dampens the subtle sensory cues you rely on. Large doses are fatal. Small doses accumulate in the system and create a fog that thickens over time." She looked up. "My lord, if you've been dosed for months, the amount in your system right now could be close to lethal all on its own." His expression remained calm, but she saw his hand tighten on the chair's arm. "Is there an antidote?" "Yes, but it takes time. Weeks, possibly months, depending on how much has accumulated. And during that time, you'd be vulnerable, weakened. She hesitated. You'd need someone you could trust absolutely to watch over you. Mordecai leaned back, a wry expression crossing his face. Well, I suppose it's fortunate I just acquired a taster with an exceptional nose and no particular reason to want me dead. He paused. Unless you do want me dead, this would be an excellent opportunity. Despite everything, Elena found herself almost laughing. I don't want you dead, my lord. Good. Then here's what we're going to do. He sat forward, and she watched him shift from frustrated victim to strategic king in the space of a breath. You're going to stay close to me, taste everything I consume, smell everything that comes near me, and help me identify who I can still trust. In exchange, I'm going to give you access to court, resources, and whatever you need to prepare this antidote, and together we're going to find out who's been poisoning me and why. The court won't like it, Elena said, a servant girl at the king's side. The court can dislike it all they want, Mordecai interrupted, and there was steel underneath the warmth now. I'm the king. My word is law, and right now, you're the only person in this entire palace I'm certain isn't trying to manipulate me. He held out his hand. Do we have an agreement? Elena looked at his outstretched hand, pale and long-fingered and steady. She thought about her mother's cards in her pocket, about the gift that had been born from grief, about the fact that this vampire king had listened to her when he had every reason to dismiss a servant's warning. She thought about his warmth, his curiosity, the way he'd made even his suspects feel human in their fear. She took his hand. We have an agreement. Over the next weeks, Elena learned to navigate a world she had only ever seen from its edges. As the king's taster, she attended every meal, every meeting, every court function. She stood at Mordecai's shoulder while he received ambassadors and adjudicated disputes. She sat at the small table in his study while he reviewed reports and correspondence late into the night. And slowly, carefully, she began to administer the antidote her mother's cards prescribed, a compound of yarrow and milk thistle and chelating agents that would bind to the poison and draw it from his blood. The court, predictably, was scandalized. It's unseemly, the Dowager Countess Marina said on the 5th day, her voice cool and precise as she addressed Mordecai during a council meeting. She was ancient even by vampire standards, her white skin almost translucent, her white hair bound in elaborate braids that spoke of centuries-old fashion. A human servant with no rank, no title, no training in courtly affairs, standing at your elbow at every moment. It suggests weakness, my lord. It suggests you cannot protect yourself. Mordecai, who had been casually reviewing a treaty document, looked up with that warm, interested expression that Elena had learned meant he was about to be devastatingly polite. Does it? How fascinating. I would have thought it suggested intelligence, Marina. After all, someone did try to poison me, and this human servant with no rank managed to detect it when no one else did. He set the document down. Unless you're suggesting I should have drunk the wine anyway, to avoid looking weak. Marina's expression flickered with something Elena couldn't quite read. Of course not, my lord. I merely suggest that there are more appropriate solutions. A trained cupbearer from one of the noble houses would have their own allegiances and their own motives, Mordecai finished. No, thank you. I prefer my taster unburdened by courtly obligations. He glanced at Elena with a slight expression of amusement. Besides, she has an exceptional nose. Don't you, Elena? I do my best, my lord, Elena said, keeping her voice neutral. But she'd caught something in the air when Marina spoke, something bitter and herbal that she'd been noticing more and more around certain council members. Not poison, but perhaps medicine. She filed the observation away. The council meeting continued, but Elena felt Marina's gaze on her throughout, cold and assessing. When the meeting finally ended and the nobles filed out, Mordecai turned to Elena with a raised eyebrow. You smelled something. It wasn't a question. He was getting better at reading her expressions, just as she was getting better at reading his. The antidote was working, slowly clearing the fog from his senses, but he still relied on her to catch what he couldn't. Medicinal herbs, Elena said, on the Dowager Countess. Valerian root, possibly, something for anxiety or sleep. Interesting. Mordecai stood, stretching with unconscious grace. Mirena hasn't slept in 200 years. Vampires don't need sleep the way you do. We can go months without it if necessary. Then why would she smell like valerian? An excellent question. He moved to the window, looking out over the city that sprawled beyond the palace walls. Modern skyscrapers glittered in the distance, a forest of glass and steel, but the palace itself was old stone and older magic, a piece of Gothic history preserved in the heart of the contemporary world. Mirena was married to my maker, did you know that? Lucien Morven. He was the previous king before he was killed in the Blood Wars 70 years ago. Elena had heard whispers about the Blood Wars, the conflict that had nearly destroyed the vampire courts before a fragile peace was negotiated. I didn't know. She's part of the old guard, Mordecai continued, the ones who remember what it was like before the treaties, when vampires and humans lived in open conflict and the courts were constantly at war with each other. She worked for decades to build the current peace. He turned back to Elena, which means she has more reason than most to want stability. You think she could be involved in the poisoning? I think she has the access, the knowledge, and the motive if she believed I was threatening the peace somehow. His expression was troubled. But Mirena isn't cruel. She isn't power-hungry. If she's involved, it's because she thinks she's protecting something. That doesn't make it right, Elena said quietly. No, Mordecai agreed. But it makes it complicated. As autumn deepened into winter, Elena fell into a rhythm she had never anticipated. Her days were full of Mordecai's presence, his voice, his laugh, his endless curiosity about everything from court politics to Elena's opinions on the novels he read voraciously in whatever spare time he had. He was nothing like the cold, distant figure she had imagined vampire royalty to be. He was warm, funny, in a dry and self-deprecating way, and genuinely interested in people in a manner that made everyone around him feel valuable. He asked her about her mother, about growing up in an apothecary shop, about the recipe cards she still carried. He listened with complete attention when she described the smell of different compounds, the way certain poisons left traces that lingered for hours, the subtle art of identifying corruption in things that were meant to heal. It's a kind of magic, he said one evening as they sat in his study, Elena preparing that night's dose of antidote while Mordecai reviewed correspondence. What you do with scent, not supernatural, but no less remarkable. It's just training, Elena said, measuring out milk thistle with careful precision. It's gift, Mordecai corrected. Training can enhance a gift, but it can't create one. You have something natural, something rare. You should be proud of it. Elena felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. No one had ever spoken about her skill with such respect. In the servants' quarters, her sensitive nose had been considered useful, but strange. Among the nobles, it was just another tool in service to their comfort. But Mordecai spoke about it as though it were art. "How are you feeling?" she asked, changing the subject because the warmth in her chest was starting to feel dangerous. "Better," he admitted. "The fog is lifting. I caught Vasily in a lie yesterday about how much he'd actually read of the Eastern Treaty provisions. It was a small thing, but I heard the hesitation in his voice, smelled the anxiety. It felt like recovering a lost limb." "That's good." Elena finished preparing the antidote and brought it to him. He drank it without complaint, though she knew it tasted vile. "Another few weeks, and you should be nearly clear. And then we'll need to make some hard decisions," Mordecai said. "Because if my suspicions are correct, this poisoning wasn't random malice. It was strategic. Someone needed me weakened for a reason." "The treaty negotiations," Elena said. It was the obvious answer. "You've been working on them for months, since before the poisoning started." "Exactly." Mordecai set down the empty cup. "The Eastern courts want concessions I'm not willing to give. Territory, hunting rights, access to human populations that I've promised to protect. If I were foggy, uncertain, unable to tell when their ambassadors were lying about their true intentions, I might agree to things that would undermine everything we've built. But who benefits from that specifically? That's the question." He stood, pacing to the window again. It was a habit when he was thinking, this restless movement. The Eastern courts, obviously. but also anyone in my own court who thinks I'm too aggressive, too willing to risk conflict. Anyone who believes peace at any cost is better than the alternative. Elena thought about Marina's cool disapproval, the medicinal herbs, the way the Dowager Countess watched Mordecai with something that looked almost like sorrow. "You think it's the Dowager," she said quietly. Mordecai was silent for a long moment. "I think she's the only one with the motive, the means, and the moral flexibility to justify it to herself. Marina lost her husband to the blood wars. She spent decades rebuilding after that loss. If she thought I was going to reignite the conflict, if she believed keeping me weak was the only way to preserve peace." He trailed off. "She wouldn't see it as betrayal. She'd see it as duty." "What will you do?" "I don't know yet," Mordecai admitted. "But I'll need to decide soon. The Eastern ambassadors arrive in 2 weeks for the final negotiations. By then, I need to be clear-headed, and I need to know exactly who I can trust." He turned to look at Elena, and something in his expression made her breath catch. It was the way he looked at her lately, with a focus and an intensity that had nothing to do with poison or politics, as though she were the most interesting thing in his very long life. "I trust you," he said simply. "I want you to know that." Elena's heart did something complicated in her chest. "My lord." "Mordecai," he interrupted. "When we're alone, just Mordecai. That wouldn't be appropriate." "I'm the king," he said with a slight expression of amusement. "I decide what's appropriate, and I'd like to hear you say my name." It felt dangerous, crossing that line from formality to intimacy, but Elena found herself saying it anyway, soft and uncertain in the quiet study. "Mordecai." His expression transformed, warming with something that looked like delight. "There. Was that so difficult?" "Yes," Elena admitted, and he laughed, bright and genuine. "You're good for me," he said. "Did you know that? Not just because you saved my life or because you're helping me recover, but because you're honest. You don't flatter or manipulate or try to tell me what you think I want to hear. You just tell me the truth. Even when it's uncomfortable? Especially then." He moved closer, and Elena was suddenly very aware of him, of his height and his grace, and the way he looked at her as though she were precious. "The truth is the rarest thing in this court. I've been starving for it." They stood there in the quiet, something fragile and electric building between them. Elena knew she should step back, should remember her place, should protect herself from the inevitable heartbreak of wanting something impossible. But she didn't move, and neither did he. Finally, Mordecai spoke, his voice careful. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Are you comfortable here? With this arrangement? With me? Because if you're not, if you feel pressured or unsafe, I need to know." The question surprised her with its sincerity. "I'm comfortable," Elena said. "More than comfortable. She hesitated, then decided to give him the truth he valued. "I like being here. I like working with you. I like that you listen when I speak, that you value what I know. I've never felt that before." Something in his expression softened. "Good. Because I like having you here. Very much." He paused. "Too much, probably." Her breath caught. "My lord." "I know," he said quietly. "I know all the reasons it's complicated. The difference in our stations, the difference in our nature, the fact that you're human, and I'm very much not. But I need you to know that this, what I feel when you're near, it's not something I take lightly, and it's not something I've felt in a very long time." Elena's heart was beating so hard she was certain he could hear it. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that somewhere between you saving my life and teaching me to trust my senses again, I've fallen for you. Completely and inconveniently." He gave her a rueful expression. "And I'm saying that I'd like to court you properly if you'd allow it. No pressure, no obligation. Just the chance to see if this thing between us could be something real." She should say no. She should protect herself, should remember that vampire kings didn't end up with human servants, that this could only end in heartbreak, But when she looked at him, at Mordecai with his warmth and his honesty and his terrible, wonderful hope, she couldn't make herself refuse. "I'd like that," Elena whispered. His expression transformed into something radiant. "Yes? Yes." He took her hand, carefully, as though she were something fragile, and lifted it to his lips. The kiss he pressed to her knuckles was gentle, reverent, and it sent heat racing through her entire body. "Then we'll do this right," Mordecai said. "Slowly, carefully, giving you every opportunity to change your mind. Because you deserve to be courted, Elena Crowley. You deserve to be treasured." And for the first time in her life, Elena believed it might be true. The courting was nothing like Elena had imagined. Mordecai was creative, thoughtful, and seemed to take genuine delight in finding ways to surprise her. He brought her rare herbs for her collection, tracked down copies of her mother's published papers on medicinal compounds, arranged for her to have access to the palace's extensive library of pharmaceutical texts. He asked her to walk with him in the palace gardens at night when the moon was full and the winter flowers bloomed pale and strange. He shared his own passions, reading her passages from his favorite novels, teaching her about vampire history and politics with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved his complicated world. But he was also scrupulously proper. He didn't push for more than she was ready to give, didn't use his authority or his nature to pressure her. Every step forward was offered as an invitation she could decline. It made her trust him in a way she hadn't known was possible. The court, meanwhile, grew increasingly hostile to her presence. Nobles who had previously ignored her now regarded her with open disdain. Servants whispered that she was ambitious, manipulative, using her position to seduce the king. The Dowager Countess's disapproval had frozen into active opposition. Marina began to speak openly in council about the inappropriateness of Mordecai's attachment to a human, the way it undermined his authority and made him look weak. "A king's consort should be chosen for strategic advantage," Marina said during a particularly tense council meeting, "not for sentiment." Mordecai, who had been listening with that deceptive calm Elena now recognized as his most dangerous mood, set down the document he'd been reviewing. "I haven't chosen a consort," he said mildly. "I've chosen a taster. Everything else is my personal business, Marina, not the council's." "Your personal business becomes the realm's business when it affects your judgment," Marina replied. Her voice was cold, precise, but Elena caught something underneath it now that Mordecai's senses were clearer. Fear. The Dowager Countess was afraid. "You're risking everything we've built for infatuation." "I'm risking nothing," Mordecai said, and his voice had taken on an edge. "The Eastern negotiations are proceeding exactly as planned. The treaties are sound. My judgment is clear, possibly clearer than it's been in months. So what exactly am I risking, Marina? Be specific." The room had gone very quiet. Elena, standing at her usual position near Mordecai's chair, watched the Dowager Countess's face and saw the moment calculation shifted to something else. Desperation, perhaps. "You're risking war," Marina said flatly. "The Eastern courts will see your attachment to a human as weakness, as proof that you've grown soft. They'll push for more concessions, and when you refuse, they'll see it as provocation. Everything I've worked for, everything Lucian died for, will collapse because you can't control yourself." Mordecai stood, and the movement was so fluid and so absolutely controlled that it made every vampire in the room straighten instinctively. This was the king, Elena realized. Not the warm, curious man she'd come to know, but the ancient predator who ruled through force of will and centuries of accumulated power. "Lucien died," Mordecai said quietly, "because he refused to negotiate, because he saw every disagreement as a challenge to his authority, because he would rather fight than compromise. I loved him as my maker, Marina, but he was a terrible king, and I will not repeat his mistakes just to make you feel secure." Marina's face went utterly still. "You don't understand what you're saying." "I understand perfectly." Mordecai's voice was still quiet, but it carried absolute authority. "I understand that you've been so afraid of another war that you've been willing to sabotage your own king to prevent it." The silence that followed was profound. Elena felt her heart hammering as the truth finally came into the open. Around the table, the other council members had gone very still. "You have no proof," Marina said finally. I have a taster with an exceptional nose who's been tracking the scent of hollow root through this palace for weeks, Mordecai said. I have my own recovering senses telling me you're lying right now, and I have the simple logic of motive and means. He paused. You had access to my private wine casks. You had the knowledge to prepare hollow root properly, and you had the motive because you genuinely believed you were saving the realm from my recklessness. If I did, Marina said, and her voice had gone very cold, it was because you were preparing to reject the Eastern Court's terms. Because you were willing to risk conflict rather than make the concessions necessary for peace. Because I watched my husband die in the last war, and I will do anything to prevent another. Even poison your king? Even that. Marina stood, and there was terrible dignity in her bearing. I won't apologize for doing what I believed was necessary. You were going to start a war, Mordecai. I couldn't allow it. I was going to negotiate honestly, Mordecai said. There's a difference between starting a war and refusing to surrender before the battle's even begun. But you were so certain you knew better, so convinced that peace at any cost was the only option, that you didn't trust me to find another way. Because there is no other way, Marina said. The Eastern courts will accept the concessions or they'll go to war. That's the reality. I kept you weak because a weak king would choose survival. A strong king would choose pride. And what if I told you I found a third option? Mordecai said. What if I told you I've spent the last 6 months preparing a proposal that gives the Eastern courts what they actually need, not what they're demanding, while protecting our own people and preserving our authority? What if your poison nearly destroyed negotiations that could have brought real, lasting peace instead of the fragile stalemate we've been living with? Marina hesitated, and Elena saw doubt flicker across her face. What kind of proposal? The kind I would have shared with my council if I'd been able to trust my own judgment, Mordecai said. The kind that requires clarity and confidence, and the ability to tell when the other side is bluffing. All things your poison took from me. He paused. You nearly cost us everything you were trying to protect, Marina, because you didn't trust me. The Dowager Countess sat down slowly, and for the first time she looked old, truly old, in a way that had nothing to do with her vampire nature. What will you do with me? Mordecai was silent for a long moment. Elena watched him, saw the conflict in his expression, the war between justice and mercy. Finally, he spoke. You'll be removed from the council, he said. You'll have no further access to palace affairs or to me personally. You'll retire to your estates, and you'll stay there unless I specifically summon you. But I won't execute you, and I won't imprison you, because I believe you genuinely thought you were protecting the realm. You were wrong, catastrophically wrong, but your intentions weren't evil, just fearful. Marina's eyes shimmered with something that might have been tears. You're more merciful than Lucian ever was. I know, Mordecai said quietly. That's the point. The Dowager Countess left the council chamber with her head high, and Elena watched her go with complicated feelings. The woman had poisoned Mordecai, had tried to control him through deliberate weakening, had nearly killed him. But she'd also done it out of genuine terror of repeating history, of losing more people she loved to war. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it made her human in her flaws, even if she wasn't human in her nature. After the council dispersed, Mordecai turned to Elena with exhaustion clear in his face. That was harder than I expected, he admitted. You did the right thing, Elena said. Did I? She tried to kill me, Elena. Slowly, carefully, with full understanding of what she was doing. Some would say I was weak to let her live. Some would be wrong. Elena moved closer, daring to reach out and touch his hand. You showed mercy where it was warranted and justice where it was needed. That's not weakness, that's wisdom. He turned his hand to capture hers, threading their fingers together. I couldn't have done this without you. Any of it. The investigation, the recovery, the decision. You've been my anchor through all of this. You would have found your way, Elena said. Maybe, but it would have been lonelier. He drew her closer, his other hand coming up to cup her face with infinite gentleness. Elena, I need to ask you something important. Her heart stuttered. Yes? The Eastern ambassadors arrive tomorrow. The negotiations will be intense, possibly dangerous. There are factions that would love to see me fail, that might try to use you to get to me. I can assign guards, I can take precautions, but I can't guarantee your safety. His thumb brushed her cheek. I need to know if you're willing to stay anyway, because I want you there. I need you there, but not at the cost of your life. Elena thought about all the reasons she should refuse, should protect herself, should step back into the safety of obscurity. Then she thought about Mordecai standing before his council, showing mercy he didn't have to show. She thought about his warmth, his curiosity, his terrible honesty. She thought about how he looked at her like she was precious. I'm staying, she said firmly. You're certain? I'm certain. His expression transformed with relief and something deeper, something that looked like love. Thank you. Then he kissed her, gentle and careful and full of restrained passion, and Elena felt the last of her defenses crumble. She was completely, irrevocably in love with the Vampire King, and there was no going back. The Eastern ambassadors arrived with a retinue of 50 vampires, all of them ancient and powerful and radiating controlled menace. Their leader was a female vampire named Serafina, tall and regal with the same white skin and white hair that marked vampire nobility, and eyes that held the weight of centuries. She regarded Mordecai with cool assessment, and Elena with open disdain. You've brought a human to treaty negotiations, Serafina said. How quaint. I've brought my taster, Mordecai replied easily. Given recent attempts on my life, I'm sure you understand the precaution. Of course. Serafina's gaze lingered on Elena, though one wonders about the appropriateness of such intimacy between king and servant. In the Eastern courts, we maintain clearer boundaries. In the Western courts, Mordecai said, still pleasant but with steel underneath, I set the boundaries. Shall we begin? The negotiations were brutal. Serafina and her delegation came with demands that would have stripped away protections for human populations, opened hunting grounds that had been closed for decades, and effectively given the Eastern courts authority over Western territory. Mordecai countered with his own proposal, carefully constructed over months of research and planning, that addressed the Eastern courts' actual needs, their genuine resource shortages and population pressures, without sacrificing Western autonomy or human safety. Elena watched and listened and smelled. She caught the anxiety when Serafina bluffed about the extent of the Eastern court's military readiness. She noticed the interest when Mordecai offered access to synthetic blood supplies that would ease hunting pressures. She detected the frustration when the Eastern delegation realized Mordecai was negotiating from a position of full clarity and strength, not the fog they'd been counting on. You're different, Serafina said on the third day, during a brief recess. The reports said you'd become uncertain, erratic, but you're neither. Reports can be misleading, Mordecai said, or outdated, or deliberately false. Serafina's eyes narrowed. Someone wanted us to think you were weak. Someone wanted us to push harder, to demand more, to provoke you into refusing so negotiations would collapse. Someone wanted a war, Mordecai agreed. But it won't be today. Elena saw calculation flicker across Serafina's face, saw her reassessing everything she'd believed about this negotiation. Finally, the Eastern ambassador smiled, sharp and genuine. You're more like Lucian than anyone gives you credit for, Serafina said. But smarter, less arrogant. I think we can work with that. The treaty that emerged over the following week was better than anyone had hoped. The Eastern courts got access to resources they desperately needed. The Western courts maintained their autonomy and their protections for human populations. Both sides agreed to joint oversight of disputed territories and regular summits to address future conflicts before they escalated. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, sustainable peace instead of fragile stalemate. When Serafina signed the final documents, she looked at Mordecai with something like respect. You've done what your maker never could, she said. You've actually ended the blood wars. We ended them together, Mordecai corrected. It took both sides choosing peace. Don't be modest. It doesn't suit you. Serafina glanced at Elena. Take care of him, human girl. He's more valuable than you know. I know exactly how valuable he is, Elena said quietly. Serafina laughed, bright and surprised. I see why he likes you. You have spine. After the Eastern delegation departed, Mordecai held a celebration feast. The court was jubilant, nobles toasting the successful negotiations and the new era of peace. But Mordecai pulled Elena aside, away from the noise and the crowd, into the quiet of the palace gardens where winter roses bloomed under the stars. We did it, he said, and there was wonder in his voice. We actually did it. You did it, Elena corrected. I just stood there and smelled things. You did much more than that. He turned to face her, taking both her hands. You gave me back my senses. You gave me back my confidence. You stood beside me when the entire court thought you didn't belong there. You were my anchor and my truth, and I couldn't have done any of this without you. Elena's throat tightened with emotion. Mordecai, I love you, he said simply. I've been trying to find the right moment to say it, the perfect words, but there aren't any. Just the truth. I love you, Elena Crowley. I love your gift and your courage and your terrible honesty. I love the way you smell danger in wine and hope in antidotes. I love who I am when I'm with you. Tears spilled down Elena's cheeks. I love you too. So much it terrifies me. He smiled, radiant and relieved, and pulled her close. Don't be terrified. Be certain, because I'm going to ask you something important, and I need you to understand I'm completely serious. What? Marry me, Mordecai said. Not because it's politically advantageous or because the court expects it, but because I want to spend whatever time we have together as your husband, because I want to wake up every night and see you first thing, because I want to build a life with you, however complicated that might be. Elena's heart was racing, her mind spinning with 1,000 reasons why it was impossible, why it couldn't work, why she should refuse. But when she looked at him, at Mordecai with his hope and his love and his terrible, wonderful certainty, she couldn't think of a single one that mattered. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. He kissed her then, deep and passionate and full of promises, and Elena felt something settle in her chest. This was right. This was real. This was everything she'd never known she wanted. The engagement announcement sent shockwaves through the court. Vampires who had barely tolerated Elena's presence as taster were appalled at the idea of a human queen. The whispers grew vicious, the opposition more organized. A delegation of nobles came to Mordecai demanding he reconsider, arguing that a king's marriage should strengthen political alliances, not indulge personal desire. Mordecai listened with that deceptive calm, then spoke with absolute finality. I will marry Elena Crowley, he said. This is not a negotiation. This is not subject to council approval. This is my decision as king and as a man, and it is final. Anyone who cannot accept that is welcome to retire to their estates, but if you stay in my court, you will show my future queen the respect she deserves. Most of the opposition crumbled after that. A few nobles did retire, choosing to remove themselves rather than accept a human queen. But most stayed, grudgingly bending to their king's will. The real challenge came from an unexpected source. 2 weeks before the wedding, a vampire elder named Theron arrived at court. He was ancient, even older than Marina, with power that radiated from him like cold fire. He demanded an audience with Mordecai, and when he was admitted to the throne room, he spoke with the authority of someone who expected to be obeyed. You cannot marry the human, Theron said flatly. Vampire law is clear. A king's consort must be capable of bearing heirs. A human cannot do that. Mordecai, seated on his throne with Elena standing at his side, raised an eyebrow. Vampire law is also clear that I can change vampire law. I am the king. Some laws are older than kings, Theron replied. The succession must be secured. If you die without an heir, the courts will fall into chaos. You know this. I'm aware of the concern, Mordecai said. But I'm not planning to die anytime soon, and when the time comes, the council can elect a successor. We have procedures for this. Procedures that will lead to war, Theron insisted. Rival claimants, disputed successions, the same chaos that destroyed the courts 100 years ago. You're risking everything for one human woman. Elena felt her chest tighten. This was the argument she hadn't wanted to face, the one she'd been dreading, because Theron was right. She couldn't give Mordecai children, couldn't secure his succession, couldn't fulfill the basic duty expected of a queen. She was human, and that limitation couldn't be changed. Or could it? Turn her, Theron said, as though reading her thoughts. Make her vampire. Then she can bear vampire children, secure the succession, take her place properly as queen. Mordecai's expression went very cold. No, my lord, be reasonable. No, Mordecai repeated, and his voice held absolute finality. Elena will remain human. That is not negotiable. Theron stared at him. You would risk civil war rather than turn your own consort? I would respect her choice rather than transform her against her will, yes. Mordecai looked at Elena, and his expression softened. This is your decision, always. If you wanted to become vampire, I would turn you gladly. But I won't pressure you, and I won't let anyone else pressure you either. Elena's throat was tight with emotion. Because he meant it, she could see that. He would let her remain human even if it cost him politically, even if it risked his succession, even if the entire court opposed him. He valued her choice more than his own convenience. But she also knew what her choice would cost him: the instability, the opposition, the very real risk of future conflict. She loved him too much to let him pay that price without at least considering the alternative. What would I lose? Elena asked quietly. If I turned, what would change? Mordecai's expression became pained. Elena, I need to know. Please. He was silent for a long moment, then spoke with careful honesty. You would become immortal, stronger, faster, nearly impossible to kill. You would gain the senses that all vampires have, the ability to hear heartbeats and detect lies and move like shadow. You would need blood to survive, though in this era we have ethical sources. You would be bound by vampire law and vampire nature. And my gift? Elena pressed. My ability to smell things, to detect poison and compounds? Would that survive the transformation? Mordecai hesitated, and she saw the answer in his face before he spoke. No, the transformation rewrites the body at a fundamental level. Your human senses, your human gifts, they would be replaced by vampire equivalents. You would lose what makes you exceptional. She would gain power, Theron interjected. Immortality, strength, a place at your side forever. Surely that's worth more than a parlor trick with herbs. Elena felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. It's not a parlor trick. It's my mother's legacy. It's the gift that saved Mordecai's life. It's what makes me me. She turned to Mordecai. If I turned, I couldn't be your taster anymore. I couldn't protect you the way I do now. I would just be another vampire, nothing special. You would always be special, Mordecai said softly. But you're right. Your gift is mortal born. Transformation would erase it. Then I choose to stay human, Elena said firmly. I choose to keep my gift. I choose to remain your taster and your truth-teller and myself. She looked at Theron. I'm sorry if that's not politically convenient, but it's my choice. Theron's expression was incredulous. You would choose mortality, aging and death and weakness? You would give up immortality for a sense of smell? I would give up immortality to be myself, Elena corrected, and to be the partner Mordecai actually needs, not just the consort the court expects. Mordecai stood, moving to her side, and his hand found hers with absolute certainty. Then that's settled. Elena will remain human. We will address the succession when and if it becomes necessary, and anyone who cannot accept that is welcome to leave. Theron looked between them, then slowly shook his head. You're both fools, but perhaps that's what love does, makes fools of even kings. He turned to go, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, I hope you're right. I hope this ends well. But don't say I didn't warn you. After he left, Elena turned to Mordecai with worry clear in her face. Was that a mistake? Should I have considered it more carefully? No, Mordecai said firmly. You should never have to change your fundamental nature to be loved. Not for me, not for anyone. I fell in love with who you are, Elena. Human, mortal, exceptional exactly as you are. I don't want you different. I want you. She kissed him then, pouring everything she felt into it, all her love and her gratitude and her certainty. When they finally broke apart, she was breathless. Then let's get married, she said. Let's do this right. The wedding was planned for the winter solstice, a night when vampire tradition held that vows made under the longest darkness would last forever. Elena worked with the palace staff to prepare, choosing flowers and music and designing a ceremony that honored both vampire tradition and human custom. Mordecai insisted she have everything she wanted, sparing no expense, turning the wedding into a celebration that would mark the beginning of a new era. The night before the ceremony, Elena stood in her chambers surrounded by the finest dress she'd ever seen, white silk embroidered with silver thread, and felt the weight of what she was about to do. She was marrying a vampire king. She was becoming queen. She was stepping into a life she'd never imagined, full of danger and politics and immortal complications. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. When she opened the door, she found Vasily, the scarred vampire who served as Mordecai's advisor. "May I come in?" he asked. Elena stepped aside, surprised. Vasily had been polite but distant throughout her time at court, clearly unsure what to make of the human taster. He entered slowly, looking uncomfortable. "I wanted to apologize," he said without preamble. "I was one of those who doubted you, who thought Mordecai was being foolish, risking too much. I was wrong." "You were protecting your king," Elena said. "I understand that. Maybe, but I should have trusted his judgment. He saw in you what I couldn't, what most of the court couldn't, that you're not just clever or gifted, you're good, genuinely good in a way that's rare, especially here." Vasily paused. "He's been different since you came, happier, more certain, more himself than he's been in all the years I've known him. That's because of you." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you for saying that. It's the truth, which I know you value." He gave her a slight expression of amusement, then turned serious again. "Tomorrow you'll become queen. The court will expect you to act like one, but I hope you won't lose what makes you special. The honesty, the courage to speak up even when it's uncomfortable. Mordecai needs that. We all need that." "I'll do my best," Elena promised. Vasily nodded, then left her alone with her thoughts and her beautiful dress and her impossible future. The wedding took place in the palace's great hall, under vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows that glowed with candlelight. The assembled court watched in silence as Elena walked down the aisle, her heart pounding but her steps steady. At the end waited Mordecai, dressed in formal black and silver, his white hair bound back, his pale eyes fixed on her with an expression of complete adoration. When she reached him, he took her hands, and the warmth of his touch settled her nerves. The ceremony was conducted by an ancient vampire priest who intoned the traditional vows in a language older than English. But when it came time for the personal vows, Mordecai and Elena spoke in words everyone could understand. "I vow to honor your choices," Mordecai said, "to protect your autonomy and respect your nature, whether mortal or otherwise. I vow to value your truth more than comfortable lies, to listen when you speak, to stand beside you rather than ahead of you. I vow to love you exactly as you are, for as long as you'll have me." Elena's voice was steady despite her tears. "I vow to be your truth-teller, your anchor in the fog, your reminder of what matters. I vow to choose you every day, knowing the complications and the risks, because you're worth them. I vow to love you fiercely and honestly, to challenge you when you need it and support you always. I vow to be your partner in all things, for as long as my mortal life allows." The priest pronounced them married, and Mordecai kissed her with such tenderness that the assembled court actually sighed. Then came the part Elena had insisted on, the symbolic gesture that would define her role. A servant brought forward a golden chalice filled with wine that had been tested 3 times for poison. Mordecai took it first, held it up to the light, then offered it to Elena. "The first cup," he said quietly, following the script they'd written together. "To the woman who saved my life and taught me to trust again." Elena took the chalice, smelled it carefully out of professional habit, then drank. The wine was sweet and strong, and she felt it warm her all the way down. Then she offered the cup back to Mordecai. "To the king who listened to a servant's warning," she said, and chose to grab her hand instead of the glass. He drank, his eyes never leaving hers, and the symbolism was complete. She was not just his wife, not just his queen. She was his cupbearer, the first in the realm's history, the human with the exceptional nose who would stand at his side and keep him safe. The celebration that followed was joyous and long. The court danced and feasted, and for the first time Elena felt truly accepted, not as an interloper, but as someone who belonged. Mordecai stayed at her side throughout, dancing with her, introducing her to nobles who had previously ignored her, making it clear through every word and gesture that she was his choice and his equal. Near dawn, they finally escaped to Mordecai's private chambers, now theirs together. Elena was exhausted and exhilarated, her heart full to bursting. Mordecai helped her out of the elaborate wedding dress with gentle hands, then pulled her close. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like I just married a vampire king," Elena said, which is to say, slightly terrified and completely happy. He laughed. "That seems reasonable." His expression grew serious. "I meant what I said in my vows. I will never ask you to be anything other than what you are. I will never push you to turn, never make you feel like your mortality is a flaw. You're perfect exactly as you are." "Even knowing I'll age and you won't?" Elena asked quietly. "Even knowing our time together will be limited? Even knowing that?" He cupped her face. "I would rather have 50 years with you as you are than eternity with someone else. Quality matters more than quantity." 50 years might be generous, Elena pointed out. "I'm human, fragile. Something could happen. Then we'll make the most of every moment we have." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "No regrets. No wasted time. Just us, being honest with each other, building something real." Elena pulled him down to the bed, and they spent the rest of the night learning each other, talking and touching and making promises in the darkness. She fell asleep in his arms as dawn broke, feeling safer and more loved than she'd ever imagined possible. The months that followed were busy but good. Elena took on her role as cupbearer with the same seriousness she'd applied to being taster. She established protocols for testing everything the king consumed, trained assistants in the basics of poison detection, and began compiling a comprehensive guide to toxic substances based on her mother's cards and her own expanding knowledge. But she was more than just the cupbearer. Mordecai insisted she attend all council meetings, sought her advice on matters of policy, valued her perspective as someone who had lived as a servant, and understood the palace from angles he'd never seen. She became, quietly but effectively, one of his most trusted advisors. The court adapted. Some nobles remained distant, uncomfortable with a human queen. But others began to see the advantages of having someone in power who could move through both vampire and human worlds, who could detect deception and speak uncomfortable truths, who genuinely cared about fairness rather than just political advantage. Elena also began to age, as humans did. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but by their third anniversary, she could see the fine lines forming around her eyes, the first silver threads in her dark hair. Mordecai never commented on it, never showed anything but love and desire when he looked at her. But Elena was aware of it, aware of the clock ticking down on their time together. She tried not to let it bother her, tried to focus on the present instead of mourning the inevitable future. But sometimes, late at night, she would wake and watch Mordecai sleep, his face peaceful and unchanging, and feel the weight of her mortality like a stone in her chest. On their 5th anniversary, Mordecai surprised her with a gift. It was a small wooden box, carefully carved, and when she opened it, she found recipe cards. hundreds of them, all in her own handwriting, documenting every poison and antidote and medicinal compound she'd studied over the past 5 years. "You've been so focused on using your gift to serve the realm," Mordecai said. "I thought you should have a record of it, something that will outlast you, like your mother's cards outlasted her." Elena looked at the cards, at the careful documentation of her knowledge, and felt something break open in her chest. "You're thinking about what happens after I'm gone." "I'm thinking about your legacy," Mordecai corrected gently. "About making sure your gift continues to protect people even when you can't. Is that wrong?" "No." Elena set the box aside and turned to him. "But it makes me think about the future, about what happens when I get old, when I can't fulfill my duties anymore. What happens to us then?" Mordecai was quiet for a moment, then spoke with characteristic honesty. "I don't know. I've been trying not to think about it because the thought of losing you is unbearable. But I suppose we'll face it when we have to, together." "What if I changed my mind?" Elena asked quietly. "About turning? What if I decided I wanted more time with you, even if it meant losing my gift?" He looked at her seriously. "Is that what you want?" Elena thought about it, really thought about it. Turning would give her immortality, would let her stay with Mordecai forever, but it would also erase what made her special, what made her useful, what made her herself. She would just be another vampire queen, decorative and political, without the gift that had brought them together in the first place. "No," she said finally. "I want to be me. I want to keep my gift for as long as I can. I want to matter, not just exist." She paused. "But I'm scared of what comes after." "So am I," Mordecai admitted. "But being scared doesn't mean we're wrong. It just means we love each other enough that losing each other would hurt. That's not a flaw, that's proof we chose right." They held each other in the quiet, and Elena felt her fear settled into something more manageable. They would face the future when it came. For now, they had each other. The years continued to pass. Elena aged, slowly but noticeably. By their 10th anniversary, her hair was more silver than dark, her face lined with the marks of time and laughter. She moved a bit slower, tired more easily. But her nose was as sharp as ever, her mind quick, her dedication to protecting Mordecai unwavering. The court had long since stopped questioning her presence. She was simply the cupbearer queen, the human who had saved their king and continued to serve him with exceptional skill. She was respected, even loved by many, for her fairness and her refusal to play political games. Mordecai remained exactly as he'd been the night they met, beautiful and unchanging. But the way he looked at Elena never changed either, never showed anything but love and desire and deep respect. He valued her more with each passing year, not less, as though her mortality made her more precious rather than diminished. On their 15th anniversary, Elena felt a change in herself. Not illness exactly, but a sense of her body beginning to slow down in ways that couldn't be ignored. She was only in her early 50s, still relatively young by human standards, but the years of stress and constant vigilance had taken their toll. She went to see the court physician, a vampire named Dr. Matthias, who had studied human medicine extensively. He examined her carefully, then delivered news that was both expected and devastating. "Your heart is wearing out," he said gently. "Not imminently, but within the next few years. The strain of your position, the constant alertness, it's been hard on your system." "How long?" Elena asked. 5 years, perhaps 10 if you slow down significantly. But Your Majesty, you need to consider your options. If you turned now, before the damage progresses further—" "No," Elena said firmly. "I've made my choice." She didn't tell Mordecai immediately. She wanted time to process, to figure out how to explain that their time was shorter than they'd hoped. But he noticed anyway, because of course he did. He always noticed when something was wrong. "Elena," he said that night, finding her in the library where she'd gone to think. "What did Dr. Matthias say?" She looked at him, at the concern in his pale eyes, and couldn't make herself lie. "My heart is failing, slowly, but inevitably. I have a few years left, maybe more if I'm careful." The expression that crossed his face was devastation, pure and simple. "No, I'm sorry," Elena whispered. Don't apologize for being mortal. Mordecai crossed to her, pulled her into his arms. This isn't your fault. This is just what happens. But Elena, please consider turning. It's not too late. We could have centuries together instead of just a few years. And I would lose everything that makes me useful to you, Elena said. My gift, my ability to protect you, the entire purpose of our partnership. I would just be a burden, decorative and useless. You would be alive, Mordecai said fiercely. You would be with me. That's all that matters. It's not all that matters. Elena pulled back to look at him. I need to matter, Mordecai. I need to be more than just your wife. I need to be your cupbearer, your truth-teller, the person who keeps you safe. That's who I am. Without that, I don't know who I'd be. You'd be Elena, he said desperately. You'd be the woman I love. That's enough. Is it? She challenged. Would you really be happy with a wife who couldn't do what I do? Who was just another vampire in a court full of vampires? Who had given up her essential self to extend her life? He was silent, and she saw the conflict in his face. Because he knew she was right. He had fallen in love with her gift as much as with her, with what she could do and who she was because of it. Turning her would save her life, but erase her purpose. I don't know how to let you go, Mordecai said finally, and his voice broke on the words. Then we'll figure it out together, Elena said. We'll make the most of the time we have. We'll prepare for what comes after, and we'll do it honestly, because that's what we've always done. They held each other in the library as night deepened, and Elena felt something shift between them. An acceptance of what was coming, a determination to face it head on instead of running from it. It hurt terribly, but it was real. And real was what they'd always chosen. Over the next 2 years, Elena and Mordecai worked together to prepare for the inevitable. Elena trained assistants in the art of poison detection, though none had her natural gift. She compiled exhaustive records of everything she knew, creating a reference library that would serve the court long after she was gone. She helped Mordecai identify trustworthy advisors who could serve as truth-tellers in her absence, people with integrity and courage even if they lacked her supernatural nose. And she made him promise that he would find someone else eventually, that he wouldn't spend the rest of his immortal life alone and grieving. I don't want anyone else, Mordecai said. Not now, Elena agreed, but someday, when the grief isn't so fresh. Promise me you'll at least try. I promise to try, he said reluctantly. But I won't promise to succeed. You're irreplaceable, Elena. So are you, she said softly. But we don't get forever. We just get now, and now is pretty good. They made the most of it. Mordecai reduced Elena's official duties, giving her more time to rest and to spend with him. They took trips to places she'd always wanted to see, made memories deliberately and joyfully. They talked about everything and nothing, filling their remaining time with honesty and laughter and deep, abiding love. In her final year, Elena's health declined noticeably. She could no longer stand for long periods, could no longer attend all the court functions. But she remained sharp mentally, her nose still keen, her dedication to protecting Mordecai unwavering. She tested everything he consumed, advised him on matters of state, and loved him fiercely. Near the end, when she was confined to bed more often than not, Mordecai rarely left her side. He held her hand, read to her, talked to her about the future of the realm and his plans to continue the work they'd started together. You've changed everything, he told her one night. The court, the treaties, the way we think about humans and vampires working together. Your legacy is going to outlast you by centuries. Our legacy, Elena corrected weakly. We did this together. We did, Mordecai agreed, but you started it. You saved my life with a whisper and changed the world. On her last night, Elena woke to find Mordecai sitting beside her, holding her hand, his expression devastated. I'm not ready, he said quietly. Neither am I, Elena admitted, but I don't think we get a choice. I love you, Mordecai said, and his voice was raw with grief. I will love you for the rest of my very long life. Nothing will change that. I love you too, Elena whispered. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for grabbing my hand instead of that glass. Thank you for everything." She closed her eyes, feeling his presence beside her, and let herself drift. The last thing she heard was his voice, soft and broken, telling her she was loved. Elena Crowley, cupbearer queen, died peacefully in her sleep with her husband holding her hand. The funeral was attended by vampires from courts across the realm, all of them coming to pay respects to the human who had changed their world. Mordecai delivered the eulogy, his voice steady despite the grief clear in his eyes. "She taught us that power isn't just strength," he said. "It's knowing when to listen. It's valuing truth over comfort. It's choosing to be yourself even when it's difficult." He paused. She was human and mortal and absolutely extraordinary, and I was privileged to love her. They buried her in the palace gardens beneath the winter roses she'd loved. Mordecai commissioned a statue to mark the spot, white marble carved to show Elena as she'd been when they met, young and determined, whispering her warning. The inscription read simply, "She saved a king by refusing to be silent." In the months after her death, Mordecai threw himself into work. He continued the policies they developed together, expanded the protections for humans, strengthened the treaties with the Eastern courts. He established the Crowley Foundation for Human-Vampire Relations, dedicated to promoting understanding and cooperation between the species. And he created the position of Royal Cupbearer as a permanent office, not tied to marriage or royal favor, but chosen purely for skill and integrity. The first official cupbearer was one of Elena's trained assistants, a young human woman with a remarkable nose and uncommon courage. Years passed, then decades. Mordecai never remarried, never took another consort. He ruled wisely and well, always keeping Elena's memory close, always asking himself what she would have advised in difficult situations. The court came to see him as a figure of both strength and profound loss, a king who had loved deeply and lost terribly and continued anyway. On the 50th anniversary of Elena's death, Mordecai visited her grave as he did every year. He stood before the statue, looking at her frozen in marble, eternally young and brave. "I kept my promise," he told her. "I tried to move on, but you were right. You are irreplaceable." He paused. "The realm is doing well. The treaties are holding. Your foundation is thriving. Everything we built together is still standing." He placed winter roses at the statue's feet as he always did, and felt the familiar ache of loss. But underneath the grief, there was also gratitude. Because she had been right about everything. Their time together had been limited, but it had been real. She had mattered, had made a difference, had been herself completely until the end. And that was worth more than immortality. Mordecai Morven, Vampire King, stood in the garden as snow began to fall, and remembered the night a servant girl had whispered, "Don't drink it, my lord," and changed his life forever. He would carry her memory, her legacy, and her love for the rest of his immortal life. And he would make certain the world never forgot Elena Crowley, the human who had saved a king and taught them all what real courage looked like. The winter roses bloomed eternal in the garden, white and perfect under the snow, and somewhere in the palace a new cupbearer was testing wine with a careful nose and exceptional skill, carrying on the tradition Elena had begun. Her gift lived on in her students, her wisdom in the policies she'd shaped, her courage in the example she'd set. She was gone, but she had never truly left. And in a court full of immortals, that was perhaps the greatest achievement of all. To have lived fully, loved completely, and mattered eternally despite the limitations of mortality. Elena Crowley had done all that, and more, and Mordecai would make certain that truth was never forgotten.